Hello, good afternoon. Well, thanks for inviting me to contribute to this year's conference around cartography. So I know that the other speakers have been focusing and will keep focusing on maps of land and sea formations from Asia and the Middle East. But with this presentation, so mapping the sky in ancient China, the world's oldest star atlas, I just wanted us to turn our gaze to the stars, which have been used as guidance for many human activities, such as farming, navigation, timekeeping, and so on, since time immemorial. So we'll be entering the field of celestial cartography or uranography, which is at the cross of astronomy and cartography, by focusing on one of the British Library's treasures, which is known as the Dunhuang Star Atlas. So it's roughly dated to the 7th century, and actually recent research even managed to narrow it down to the second half of the 7th century, so for the very short period between 649 to 684 of our era. So that would be the early Tang dynasty in China. So this is the oldest and the most complete known star atlas in the world, and also the first pictorial representation of the classical Chinese constellations. So, Chris, I can't move my slides. There we go. Better. So the story of the Star Atlas begins in northeast China, in the present-day province of Gansu. So this is like a map to give you an idea. And the place that I'm going to be talking about, where the star chart comes from, is here. So that's near a town called Dunhuang, which was located at the cross of the northern and southern trade routes known as the Silk Roads that were connecting China to the west. So it's at the edge of the Gobi Desert, and not far from it, maybe 25 kilometers, there's a very important Buddhist complex of over 500 caves. So these are quite recent pictures I took in 2018, and here at the bottom you've got a graph that really shows you how that cliff face, which is just outside Dunhuang, has been honeycombed or carved with hundreds of caves, so small, of different sizes, so small shrines or bigger temples, which once teamed with Buddhist monks. So these were carved between the 3rd and the 14th, 13th century of our era, and they've been plastered, and inside they've got very rich like mural paintings as well as painted sculptures. So this is also one of the most significant archaeological sites along the Silk Roads, and is now a World Heritage Site classified by the UNESCO. But by the end of the 19th century, the site had been abandoned and had fallen into ruins. So for some reason we don't know, and that's something that made this site even more famous, at the start of the 11th century, so some time after the year 1000, one small cave within that Buddhist complex was sealed up. And so its entrance was actually painted over with murals. So here you've got a black and white photograph, which was taken by the explorer Oral Stein. And you can see here on the right, that tiny door is actually the entrance to what is now known as the library cave. So here on that map, for instance, you can see how it sits in relation to that bigger cave known as Cave 16. And so what was really extraordinary about that room, which was discovered pretty much by accident by a local gentleman called Wang Yuanlu, who was conducting some restoration works, is that inside it was packed from floor to ceiling with tens of thousands of manuscripts and printed documents, but also Buddhist paintings and some artifacts. So sometime after its discovery in 1900, so the explorer, so British-Hungarian explorer and archaeologist Oral Stein was conducting his second mission to Central Asia, That's a picture of him during his third expedition, accompanied by his dog Dash. He had several Dashes in the course of his expeditions. And he arrived at Dunhuang in 1907 and managed to acquire some of the manuscripts that had been sealed up in the library cave. So most of these documents relate to Buddhism. Well, obviously that makes sense, but there are also a few socio-economic texts and a few others that concern fields like medicine, divination, and astronomy, so including our wonderful Dunhuang star charts. So here we go. Here is the focus of the presentation today. So it's actually a long scroll that measures most part of 4 meter long, and it's in 2 parts. So we will focus on the second part of the document. So Chinese scrolls are basically read from right to left. So you'd have to go from the right-hand side of the slide and then move your eyes towards the left to actually follow the reading direction of the document. And so at the bottom, you've got the parts of the scroll that we'll be looking at more particularly. And it's 2.10 meter long. So that's, to give you an idea, that's just a bit over the length of a double-sized bed. So if that speaks to your mind. And the whole manuscript is actually made of very fine mulberry paper, which is almost see-through, but it shows that it was probably a precious document made of a precious material. But again, before I delve into more details about the Dunhuang star chart itself, I just wanted to talk really very briefly about the history of astronomy in China, because the Dunhuang star chart actually fits within a long-established tradition of observing and studying the celestial sphere. The Chinese were meticulous in recording astronomical events such as comets, sunspots, novas, and solar flares, and that was long before any other culture made such observations. And several archaeological objects testify to this. So I couldn't resist but pick this item, which is also in the British Library collections, and it's dated from the 2nd millennia before the Common Era. And this particular oracle bone, which is fully digitized, carries, so here you've got the character for moon, but it carries at the back on the reverse side, it carries the record of a lunar eclipse. So that really goes to show that 2 millennia before our era, people in China were able to make such records based on their very meticulous observation of the skies. And another item that also I wanted to mention today is a silk scroll that's about 1.5 meter long. This one is not from our collections. It's actually in China and was excavated in Changsha, so Mawangdui, it's from tomb 3. And it's very interesting. It's thought to be a compilation of comets that were seen across a period of several centuries. So roughly between the 3rd and the 2nd century before the Common Era. So I just wanted to show you those 2 very emblematic items to really show how the Dunhuang star chart fits within a long-established tradition. So ancient Chinese astronomers attempted to catalog every single star pretty early on, and list of the Chinese constellations were maintained all through Chinese history and did not change much over time, which has obviously an incidence on the star chart itself. And they're known to result from 3 different schools that were led during the Warring State periods. And although no catalogues, the original documents haven't survived, they're referred to in historical sources such as the historical records, or Shiji, by the historian Sima Qian. So what we can say is that despite the lack of surviving items, there's ample evidence to show that possibly uranography had reached a very high level of attainment quite early on in China, in ancient China. And just to say that possibly not many of these items have survived, but there could have been several more star charts. So for instance, this is a Dunhuang map of the North Pole, and it's actually It comes from the library cave, or cave 17, so near Mogao, and that one is now in China, so Dunhuang City Museum. And so it's a manuscript fragment that shows on paper as well, that represents incompletely the polar region, but not the rest of the sky. And another document that I thought was quite interesting too, and which is also from the same provenance, but now in French collections, so at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, is this scroll. I've only picked an image of the end of the scroll, which contains a text whose content is very similar to that of our Dunhuang star chart, because it's got a list of the lunar lodges or mansions. So that was the way the sky was divided in ancient China, and also includes a catalogue of stars, including a treaty according to the 3 schools that I mentioned in passing. So now moving on to the British Library's very own star atlas. So unlike the map from Dunhuang that represents the North Pole, or some of the other items that we looked at earlier, the Dunhuang star chart gives a full representation of the Chinese sky at night. And it's basically the Chinese sky between declinations, so 40 degrees north to 40 degrees south. So that's roughly the belt that would follow the celestial equatorial region. So the document is divided in 12 successive charts. So again, you'd have to start looking at them from right to left. And there, so yes, another important thing is also that the top of the scroll actually corresponds to the north, and west is right, east is left. So basically that means that the longitudes grow from right to left, so they unfold in the same direction as the scroll itself. And finally, so after these 12 successive charts or maps, you've got a 13 chart, which is a circular chart portraying the North Polar region. So it's in that sense very similar to the other map at Dunhuang that I showed you, that square fragment, which was representing the same area of the sky. So at the end of the scroll, you also have a figure, a drawing of an archer. So it's called Dianshan. So that's the god of thunder. And then you can see the document is incomplete. This is an old restoration. So what's interesting is that the star positions are actually drawn as observed from a latitude of 34 degrees north, which was possibly where the Imperial Observatory was located. So that could have been in Chang'an, present-day Xi'an, or maybe another site in Luoyang. And interestingly, the map is also in strict accordance with the astrological catalogues that of stars that were established during the Warring State period. So the catalogues that I mentioned earlier, and that basically are linked to 3 very important astronomers. And so in order to differentiate between these 3 catalogues or schools, the stars are represented as different colored dots. So for instance, Shushan was one of those astronomers, was traditionally associated with red, and you've got red dots here, but you also have black dots who correspond to Ganda. And then Wu Xian, who's also the leader of the 3rd school, is then traditionally associated with white, and then later on yellow. So I think we would just get those empty dots as probably signifying white. And so the stars themselves are actually joined by black lines that materialize the constellations or asterisms. So they're over, in the scroll itself, there are over 250 asterisms, which are labeled by their Chinese names. So you can see here Chinese, I've lost my arrow, Chinese names next to them. I think I'd quite like to get my arrow back, sorry. Yes, there it is. So yeah, because most of these names are actually associated with practical objects or persons of the Chinese Empire. So I wanted to stop on this particular on this particular map, because for some of you may have seen that it corresponds to what we now know as the constellation of Orion. And because it's got that familiarity, I thought it would be nice to look at it into more detail. So for instance, you've got the three stars here, three bright stars that don't really form the belt. These two bright stars also identifiable, but to the Chinese, it was a completely different asterism. So these stars were actually associated with a warrior called Chen, and at his foot and at his feet, he had another constellation known as the Well of Jade constellation. So that's the little circle here. So Yujin, and he's armed with his banner. So in that sense, not too different from Orion, and protected by the army of Prince here, who came on their who traveled on their 5 chariots. So and so on. Yeah, this circle of stars, for instance, is called the Chunshi, so the soldiers' market. And as I said, the Chinese like to put very concrete elements in the skies too. So interestingly, here you've got those 4 stars, and that's the character. So this is thought to be the soldiers' latrines. So just to show how relatable it is, even looking at a map of the sky. But importantly, I also wanted to show that the star chart not only is a beautiful, it's beautifully handwritten and with those different colored groups of stars, but it is a very accurate astronomical document. And despite being catalogued by Lionel Giles, who was a British curator at the British Museum in the 50s, and its significance being acknowledged by several scholars, both in the UK and overseas, and I mean in particular in China, where several scholars wrote about it, the star chart was somehow not the subject of proper scientific analysis until quite recently. So in the early 2000s, so 2004, I think, 2 French researchers from the French Atomic Energy Commission took an interest in it. And their research revealed that the Dunhuang star atlas is not a simple and hastily handmade reminder. It's both extremely detailed and astonishingly accurate. So they counted, I think they said they couldn't reach a perfect census because some of the names of stars overlap. There are a few mistakes, but I think they counted over 1,300 stars, which are arranged into 257 groups of asterisms. So in the Chinese astronomy, there are also many more constellations that we have. And so our star chart includes also some faint stars that would be very difficult to see with the naked eye, and also several stars that are located on the southern hemisphere. But it's amazing considering that astronomers managed to draw that map based on what they could see with the naked eye, and that is like centuries before the telescope was invented. And so Bidot and Pradry, who were those 2 scientists I mentioned, also looked at the methods that allowed the author of the star chart to represent the stars on the celestial sphere on the flat support. So like in this instance, a roll of paper. And so as they were observing the map, they realized that the scales that were used across the 12 different charts were extremely uniform, and that they were also pretty exact. And so they also showed that the position of the brightest stars are remarkably accurate. So sometimes by 1 degree, which is absolutely amazing. I mean, such precision did not exist anywhere else in the world for the period, at least not that we know of. And they reached the conclusion that this precision comes from the fact that the map was established according to very precise geometrical rules, using projection methods that are actually similar to the ones that we use today to produce our modern maps, but that were only introduced in Western Europe during the Renaissance. So we're looking at the 16th century here, when the map is from the 7th century.
Mélodie, 5 minutes.
Yeah, For the 12 rectangular maps, and so for instance here, they established, they demonstrated through comparisons with, for instance, a modern reconstruction of the sky that they plotted with the Mercator projection, that it must have been very similar to the Mercator projection. And again, for the 13th chart, which represents the North Pole, they also established that it must have been based on the stereographic projection, which preserves the directions of the stars, but from a central point, hence the sort of circular aspect of it. So my final part, which hopefully I'll manage to cover in 5 minutes. So what could this map be? So in all likelihood, it would have been an imperial divination tool. So in ancient China, the sky was considered to be the mirror of the human world. And this conception of an organic cosmos or a universal order where the celestial movements and political activities of the empire were interconnected is particularly reflected in the last map of the Dunhuang star atlas. So here you've got a little close up. And so the North Polar region in particular would be the equivalent of the empire and the imperial court, with the emperor at its center. Was not represented here, but I think scientists managed to basically guess where it would have been located based on the position of the other stars in this group. So the emperor would have been at the center of the North Pole, and would have been the stationary point around which all stars turn. So if I get so you see those rows of stars, for instance, they're supposed to symbolize or represent the bounds of the Forbidden City, where the emperor resided, and then you get a number, so that would be the parasol, and here these 4 stars, for instance, so that you'd have the 4 advisors indicated by the name of the constellation, and so on. And maybe at the bottom, some of you have managed to immediately recognize what we call the Big Dipper. So that would have been seen as the chariot that the emperor used to travel his kingdom. So again, I will mention that very quickly, but as I said, the scientists managed to guess where the North Pole would have been situated, and that also gave them a date of around 700 for the star chart. So yes, astronomy was very much an imperial preserve, and emperors directly employed astronomers to chart the heavens and record phenomena. And that was for 2 main purposes: 1, to record time accurately, and 2, to make predictions, because the Chinese emperor also thought celestial clues for political and warfare decisions. And so if, for instance, a planet or a comet entering a constellation was considered an omen for the terrestrial equivalent. So on the Dunhuang star chart, you've got the 12 maps actually come with a few lines of text on the left that name the region of the sky, as well as the astrological predictions associated to it. So, and also the part of the Chinese empire that was thought to be influenced by that division. So here to the right, you've got a translation by Professor Imre Galambos from Cambridge. It's also available on the IDP website, so I will leave you to read it. But it really shows that close link between astronomy and astrology in ancient China, and how they were very intertwined. So a map this sophisticated would not have been for public use. It's very unlikely, because the ability to look up at the skies and interpret its signs was so highly prized that these types of maps were tended to be protective state documents. And we think that it was the Dunhuang star chart was possibly used for uranomancy, and that's actually possibly confirmed by the content of that's at right at the start of the roll of the scroll, where as I said, the star chart follows a previous text, which is actually divination based on cloud formations. So at the top, it's divided in 2 registers. So at the top, you get different shapes. These are clouds, believe it or not. And then these are the predictions associated to each of those cloud shapes. So again, it's like divination based on, the so-called meteoromancy. So finally, just to conclude, I just wanted to say that the Dunhuang Star Atlas really shows a culture of scientific sophistication, where we was following its own tradition with groupings of stars and divisions of the sky that are completely different to the Greek tradition, which is generally more well known. But as this is the earliest surviving detailed map of the entire northern sky and predates all others by centuries, we still don't know to this day why it was found in Dunhuang, so far away from the Chinese capital. And so it has been suggested in the past that because the paper is so thin, that this document was actually superimposed over another original scroll, and then that the star chart itself was traced over. But yes, we still don't know why a political and secret document would have ended up so far, right at the start of the Silk Road, and whether it would have served military purpose or would have been helped for travel, used for travel. All right, that's me done. If you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you, Mélodie. Thank you very much indeed for really explaining this old map, this old celestial map. It really to bring it to life. Sarah, have we any questions, please, for Mélodie?
Yes, we have. We have two questions from Diana about colors. So the first one, it's something that you might have mentioned already in the presentation, and is about the selected stars colored in red. Do you have any idea why they are in red and what's the meaning of them being in red? And the second question is there any material analysis that has been undertaken so far concerning the colors in this star chart?
So first question, yes, sorry, I covered it, but so fast. The red stars, yes, it's only a few of them, and there would be stars that appeared in the catalogue compiled by the astronomer Shushan. So as I was saying, during the Warring State period, there were 3 schools led by 3 famous astronomers, and hence the 3 different colors that you can see on the star chart. With regards to the material analysis, I don't think any was done on this particular scroll. I don't know. My guess would be that quite often on Dunhuang scroll we find vermilion and so on for red, but again, I cannot talk without any analysis being done on this particular red pigment. And the black ink is probably carbon ink.
Thank you. And then Claudia is asking, are the names of the constellations the same today?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And the second question from Claudia as well is, isn't the ghost with the arrow that you showed at the end of the scroll the ghost of a thunder god?
Yes, so it's called Dianshan. That was exactly written also in traditional characters right next to that figure. Yes. And the flat hat was actually also part of the reason why the scroll was dated to quite early on.
Thank you. A question from Paul, who is asking, did China have a scientific revolution as reflected in their maps?
I don't know if I understand the question right. Is it possible to get a bit more detail, or? I mean, it's the problem of not having, because the material that has survived, obviously we don't know how much was lost, so it's very difficult to know whether there was a revolution as such or whether it was just a continuous tradition whereby, you know, all that scientific knowledge was gradually built upon the observations made by astronomers. So I don't know if I've answered the question. If not, just yeah.
Thank you. In case, I would suggest Paul to be in touch directly with you. And I think we have only 1 minute for one last question, which is, are there any known astronomers or artisans that we know might have contributed to these star charts?
Yeah, well, that's a that's a very good question, especially because in that first section of the scroll where you've got the divination based on cloud formations, it actually mentions there's possibly a reference to Li Chunfang, who was a famous mathematician and astronomer in the Tang Dynasty, and he was actually probably a contemporary, so around the mid 7th century. So quite possibly the original map, or this one was. It's one of the theories. It was possibly drawn by him, or yeah, created by him.
Thank you. I don't think we have any time more, but there are still a couple of questions that maybe Melody, you will be able to answer directly in the chat.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And again, thank you, Melody, for a great presentation. Thank you very much. We're going to just take a